has several times expressed frustration that the Russians are not doing more. He hasn't yet done anything to express that frustration. So even though the United States has significant leverage, it could apply to pressure Russia in terms of providing more military assistance to Ukraine, proceeding to tighten sanction loopholes to increase the sanction impacts on Russia, in terms of moving with the Europeans to seize Russian central bank assets. There's a lot of things that the United States could do and the president could do that would confront Putin with the prospect that if he continues the war and doesn't negotiate in a serious way, the economic, military, and political costs for Russia are going to increase. But unfortunately, the president has not applied any of that leverage. And unless he does, I don't think he's going to succeed. His mediation effort is going to fail.
And to your point, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine recently, Bridget Brink, just resigned last month after 3 years in her post, and is now speaking out about why she made that decision. Listen.
I resigned from Ukraine and also from the Foreign Service because the policy since the beginning of the administration was to put pressure on the victim Ukraine rather than on the aggressor Russia. I fully agree that the war needs to end, but I believe that peace at any price is not peace at all. It's appeasement. And as we know from history, appeasement only leads to more war.
Jeff, if Putin is the last one in President Trump's ear, how do you see that shaping what comes next?
Well, it's a great question, Anna, because the asymmetry here is stark. You have Donald Trump, who is pushing for a quick end to this war, and you have Vladimir Putin, who has shown that he is ready for a protracted conflict as this war enters its fourth year. He has basically said, reporting out of the Kremlin, is that he is completely unmoved by the threat of further sanctions, in large part because Russia's economy has already adjusted to years of severe sanctions. And he also appears that he is really not really willing to take any off-ramp that is given to him. And so the question becomes, the fear among European capitals around the world is that Kyiv will be pressured into giving up more ground. And that if the U.S. does decide that Vladimir Putin is not operating in good faith, that, to take J.D. Vance at his word, the U.S. would just walk away and say this isn't our war. Well, who would that benefit? It certainly wouldn't benefit the West. It would benefit Vladimir Putin, who by all outward appearances views this war as existential and does not view it in his political benefit or in the benefit for Moscow to wind things down, as evidenced by that drone strike, that massive drone strike just yesterday.
We know, of course, Putin's phone call with President Trump is a huge focus that we're all trying to get readouts on today. But there's also the phone call with Zelenskyy that's expected. And yesterday, we know Zelenskyy had a good meeting, at least that's how he is reporting it out, with Vice President J.D. Vance, as well as Secretary of State Marco Rubio. This was after Pope Leo's inauguration mass. And you can see the picture here with the vice president and Zelenskyy smiling and laughing together. This is a photo provided by the White House. Pretty striking after that Oval Office blow up just a few months ago. What more, Gabe, are we learning about that meeting and how those leaders came together?
It really is remarkable to see that picture side by side with that eruption here in the Oval Office, you're right, several months ago. But there does seem to be just a slightly different posture with the Trump administration when it comes to dealing with Ukraine. We heard the White House officials, including Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt today, call that meeting between Vice President Vance and Zelenskyy a productive meeting. We heard as much from Ukrainian President Zelenskyy as well, who said that they touched upon the need for sanctions against Russia and also spoke about bilateral trade and defense cooperation and upcoming prisoner exchanges. But Zelenskyy really used this opportunity, he says, to impress upon the United States the urgency of this and to try and get the Trump administration to ramp up the pressure on Vladimir Putin. Question will be whether President Trump is swayed by whatever Putin has to say to him today during this phone call. We'll be watching on that.
Ambassador, President Trump has been calling for a 30-day ceasefire to help pave the way for peace talks, yet Russia just unleashed its largest series of drone attacks since the war began over the weekend, launching hundreds of strikes. Other cities were also shelled, including residential areas, according to Ukraine. Was that meant to be a not-so-subtle message from President Putin? Is Russia anywhere close to agreeing to peace?
No, I think at this point we have seen a Russian approach that is prepared to continue the war. And it's helped, I think, in part by inconsistency in the White House. So go back a week ago Saturday, President Zelenskyy met with the leaders of France, Britain, Germany, and Poland, and they agreed that there should be a demand to Russia for a ceasefire with negotiations then to follow, but that if Russia did not quickly agree to a ceasefire, that there would be harsher Western sanctions. And they had a phone call then a week ago Saturday with President Trump. He agreed to that. That was the position. On Sunday, Putin says no to a ceasefire. I'll do direct negotiations. And President Trump flips to that. So I think there's a concern, is the White House going to be consistent here? But what I think Putin is trying to do, he does not want a ceasefire. He has rejected the administration's proposal back in March for a ceasefire. What he wants to do instead is to have direct negotiations, but that's going to be a mechanism that allows the Russians to simply bog the talks down in details for months and months and months while they continue military operations. And this is why I think it's important that if the president really wants to try to bring an end to this war, he needs to start penalizing Russia for its bad behavior and make it clear that the costs to Russia are going to escalate if Russia does not get serious about a ceasefire and a negotiation.
I want to bring in NBC's Yamiche Alcindor, who's covering the White House. Peter Baker is the New York Times chief White House correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. Michael Crowley is also with the Times and covers the State Department and U.S. foreign policy. So, Yamiche, what do we know about this call and what the president is wanting here?
Well, the big question is, how long is this call going to go? From our understanding, the call is underway. We haven't gotten any information from the White House that the call has ended. So this could be a very long call between these two leaders. Now, President Trump has really raised the stakes here. He said that nothing could happen when it came to these peace talks to try to end this war between Russia and Ukraine unless he and Vladimir Putin spoke directly. So that is now happening. We also have heard from White House officials and top Trump aides that the two at some point might be getting together in person. We know, of course, that the president is also planning to speak separately with the president of Ukraine as well as NATO leaders later on today. So also watching to see what happens there. Our understanding is that European leaders are pushing for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. We're not sure if President Putin is going to agree to that. President Trump is saying that he wants a complete end to what he's calling a bloodbath. The other thing that's interesting here is that even after we saw that disastrous Oval Office spray between President Trump and the president of Ukraine, where President Trump said that he was disrespectful and said that he didn't want to end the war, we've now seen President Trump sort of take a sharper tone actually against Russia, something that he hasn't done in the past, saying that he might have sanctions against them. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the president says after this call ends and sort of what is the next step here, because there's a lot riding on this. I should also note that the vice president is out just today in the last few hours in Italy saying that if the U.S. doesn't see enough progress, that they could walk away altogether. That, of course, would be really, really hard for Ukraine. So a lot riding on this call, and definitely something that we're continuing to report on. Chris.
So, Michael, the president has been pushing for an end to this war for months. It hasn't happened, obviously. So why should we think that it will be different this time? What are the, I guess, circumstances surrounding it that might make it possible to happen?
Oh, I don't think we should think that it will be different this time fundamentally, substantively. You know, something I will be looking for is whether Vladimir Putin plays this in a clever way, which is to give Trump something in this call where Trump can walk away and say that he's gotten a concession and that they're making progress, but something that doesn't actually box Putin in. I mean, it's clear at this point that Putin thinks he has an upper hand and wants to continue the war. And does not want to do the kind of comprehensive deal that Trump is looking for. But at the same time, despite these increasing threats from the White House, just given everything we know about Trump going back for a decade now, it's very difficult to imagine Trump confronting Putin or escalating pressure against him. You really get a sense that Trump wants to be in Putin's good graces. So I think Trump, based on what we know, will be very eager to take anything from Putin, maybe some kind of a partial brief ceasefire like we saw the Russians agree to weeks ago, something very limited and partial, and say that he's making progress and essentially kick the can down the road. That would be one very likely scenario to me. The one last thing I would say here is I think the biggest question is that if Putin proves more intransigent than that and he doesn't give anything, you hear administration officials talk about walking away from this process. And the question is, does walking away mean just no longer trying to mediate a peace agreement, or does it mean walking away from everything, including support for Ukraine, which would be a de facto huge victory for Russia if America is not going to resume support for Ukraine? So that's the giant question looming in the background here.
Peter, I want to play part of what the Vice President, J.D. Vance, had to say about all of this just this morning.
Look, I think one open question is Vladimir Putin serious about negotiating peace, right? He has made some concessions. He has taken some serious steps in these conversations, but we feel like, we're at a point where we're hitting an impasse, and that's why the president is talking to him on the phone. I think, honestly, that President Putin, he doesn't quite know how to get out of the war.
So he doesn't know how to get out of the war, Peter, and also suggests he doesn't have a strategy. Do you think Putin is under any pressure? What is the pressure the White House thinks it has to bring to bear?
Well, I think actually very few people think that Putin is serious about ending the war at this point. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. He seems to think he has the upper hand. He has bragged that he is making progress on the battlefield, exaggerating what's actually happening there, of course. And as Michael just rightly pointed out, if the alternative to a peace deal that he doesn't want is the United States walks away from Ukraine, that is, as Michael said, a victory, because
Donald is getting played here, and he's getting played positively by Zelenskyy and negatively by Putin. And I think this goes all the way back to that meeting earlier this year. The one where J.D. Vance was like, have you even said thank you? Well, of course, Zelenskyy had said thank you to the American people many, many times, and to the office of the president many, many times. But besides the point, that meeting was essential for Zelenskyy to expose the inner workings and inner thoughts of Trump and Rubio and Vance and the entire upper echelon of the Trump regime. Because now we know, even more than before, we knew what Trump's mindset was and how it was very, beneficial for Putin. And so going forward and all of these discussions, people were more awakened. People were more aware, more primed to be ready for Trump bending to Putin. And all of that is something, yes, of course we knew. It's not that it was a total shock, but the reason that meeting was so shocking, even though we knew Trump was much more pro-Russia than he was pro-Ukraine, we knew this, is that it was so blatant. And it was worse than we thought. Because if we expected something different, then that meeting wouldn't have been the blockbuster that it was for a couple weeks. And it's playing out now. Zelenskyy exposing Trump, not in a private meeting where we heard rumors about what may or may not have been said and how Trump was rude, but a live meeting like that, where the entire planet got to see Trump be Putin's buddy. That's the reason why today Zelenskyy is still defeating Trump in the court of public opinion.